A couple days ago, I made a video talking about where I think all of the agents are in the game relatively. And there's one agent that I wanted to kind of focus in on a little bit more because I think the story is quite interesting, and that is ISO. Now, ISO has had a weird journey here in Valorant since coming into the game. When ISO first released, many people thought that ISO was just completely garbage, just not really very good at anything. In ranked, he was kind of a worse Reyna. In pro play, Reyna was already unusable, so being a worse Reyna made you completely unusable, and ISO's pick rate sat at 0% pretty much forever. In fact, it took a very long time for anyone to even try ISO because he was considered that bad. But then things changed in patch 8.11 midway through the VCT 2024 season, because in that patch, what Riot decided to do was allow ISO to grant himself a shield during an animation where he can't use his gun for 1 second, and he would just get the shield. Now, this was a major change, and they changed some other things here as well, as you can see, but really the major change was him being able to just get a shield straight away, rather than having to get a kill to then get a shield. And with this patch, ISO, everyone was like, oh my god, this agent all of a sudden is incredible, and you can do some really crazy things with this agent and really just completely take over games with ISO all of a sudden. And so very quickly, it became apparent to many pro teams that they should start picking ISO. And they did start picking ISO. Even very top teams at the highest levels like Fnatic, Team Heretics were all of a sudden playing ISO on multiple maps, and he kind of became the it thing for a brief period. But it was a brief period, because very quickly Riot realized that they maybe had made a little bit of a mistake, and so decided to tone ISO down somewhat. And the nerf that they chose to give was two things to the ISO double tap, which was removing the duration from 20 seconds to 12 seconds and completely getting rid of the signature kill reset. Now, what this essentially did was it meant that you couldn't completely snowball around. You would still get the shield, and if you got a kill, you could still refresh the shield in that time. Obviously, the time reduction made that a bit trickier, but generally 12 seconds was probably still way within the range of when you knew you were about to take a fight, because, you know, you could tell if your opponents are close a lot of the time. You know, you have a decent sense that someone might be there. You pop the shield, you take the fight, you see if it's good enough. 12 seconds should be enough to do that. And the signature kill reset being removed was a very big deal. But in my opinion, it was a much bigger deal for ranked games. And I think that that's really where this nerf was targeted, because in ranked games with the signature kill reset, it essentially meant that if you had an ISO who was, you know, very good in the lobby, they could essentially just continually have a shield for almost the entire round, and, you know, your opponents wouldn't be able to do anything about it because they would constantly be getting kills. But at the highest levels, that's not going to happen as often, right? People aren't going to be taking dry 1v1s all the time at the highest levels of the game. And so it felt like less of a nerf at that kind of level, because the truth of the matter is, at the highest levels, often you're using that utility to really find that first kill. You know, that first kill is very, very important in a pro game, because if you ask most pro coaches and most pro teams, hey, when you're a player up, you know, are you then expecting to win the round? A lot of them say, yeah, we should be able to then trade out, you know, every other kill and just trade it down. We end up winning the round. That first kill is really, really the important one. And of course, you still can have that advantage in that first kill, right? If our ISO takes a fight for that first kill, well, I've got a shield and you don't. So I should win that fight still, right? And even though I'm not constantly getting shields throughout the round no matter what, I can still then refresh the shield potentially for when the next guy comes to try and trade. So we're still potentially in a pretty good advantage for the next couple fights. Yeah, maybe I can't have a shield for all 5 fights in the round, but I might for the first couple. And if I can for the first couple and we win those fights and we end up in a 5v3 or a 4v3, at a pro level, that should be like, well, we should just win the round, right? And some rounds you will just automatically win at that point because your opponent will go and save. So whilst this was definitely a nerf to ISO, I was very, very surprised to see that at the highest levels of the game, basically ISO disappeared. Now, there was one notable caveat to that, which was Fnatic. Fnatic continued to play ISO on Haven, and they actually found a lot of success playing ISO on Haven. They didn't lose a single game running that comp, and in fact, the couple other times that someone else ran that comp as well, they also found success. And yet, even though Fnatic were going on this win streak on Haven and showing everyone that essentially, hey, this could work, still no one else wanted to pick up the ISO. Still, it was just a barren zone without ISO for the most part. And so why is that? Why did everyone just give up on ISO? Even, yes, he got a nerf, and I understand the psychological impacts of an agent got nerfed, therefore people just think it's bad because it isn't as good as it used to be. But as I'm saying, it's still pretty good. And yeah, part of ISO's kit, if we look at his kit as a whole, yeah, the wall, pretty useless. The vulnerable, kind of whatever, right? But the ult and the shield are so good that I was really quite surprised that we still didn't see quite a bit of ISO towards the end of the season. But the main reason, in my opinion, why we didn't is because how ISO fits into team comps. Because ISO does not fit very well into team comps. Because if we take a look at that Fnatic comp again, what you'll see is that they've had to make some pretty extreme decisions to get to that point. Because when it comes to building pro team comps, there's kind of a list of 5 key things that most pro teams are going to want on most maps. Now, some maps this doesn't quite work as well, but for most maps, you're going to want smokes, you're going to want some kind of sentinel trap utility, you're going to want some kind of movement duelist, you're going to want some kind of recon initiator, and you're going to want some kind of flash. Well, unfortunately, ISO doesn't bring any of that to the table. So he basically just doesn't fit into a normal standard pro team comp. However, there are certain ways you can get around this, like Fnatic did with their comp, where they have smokes with Omen, they have Cypher utility for the Sentinel stuff, they have a recon initiator in Sova, and they have Yoru, who both doubles as both the movement duelist to dive deeper into sites, and gives them the flash as well. And that basically opens up a free slot. By playing Yoru, they essentially said, hey, we've got a whole free slot now to play ISO. And I did find this pretty interesting because some other teams earlier on Haven were also trying a neon ISO kind of version. But this version did not work out so well whatsoever. And of course, they were lacking that kind of flash potentially that would mean that their comp doesn't kind of have all the elements that you might want in a normal team comp. And so that to me is the main thing that's kind of pulling ISO back, which is the fact that he just doesn't fit into most of these team comps. However, there is good news for ISO, and that is Riot kind of introduced another agent into the game now that will be eligible for next year's VCT that also kind of doubles as some of those different roles as well. And that of course is Vice, because Vice does give you some of that sentinel utility, right? You do have the wall to place, which you can use, for instance, on attack side as just a normal kind of cypher trip if you wanted to as well, and give you that information. But Vice also has a flash, also gives you some information, so kind of does some of the role there of some of these other agents, and maybe that would open up some space for ISO. And another agent that could fit into this camp as well, of course, is Skye, and we've basically already seen it happen with Skye, where Skye basically was the meta for 2023 because Skye can kind of act as both the flash initiator and the recon initiator in one, and that means that essentially you can open up another slot for your team comp and play something else. Now, Skye isn't in the best position, and Vice's position in the game is still unknown, and Yoru is a tricky agent to play that most teams, probably won't want to play a lot. So that is the kind of problem for ISO, is that perhaps the 3 agents that could open up the team comp somewhat to allow ISO to be played are either in unknown spots or maybe aren't in the best position in the game to do so. However, if this ever did come about where Riot decided to buff Skye again in some way and people of a sudden started playing Skye more, or if teams really did lean into Yoru and tried to make that work on some certain maps, or if Vice does end up being good and being played on a variety of maps, I wouldn't shock me if a ton of teams then turned and said, hey, we've got a guy who can really shoot, let's just put him on ISO.